At a forgotten Montana auction, when the crowd laughed at a scarred, half-blind horse no one wanted, Henry Callahan quietly raised his hand. For just $100, he took home what others had thrown away. But that single choice would uncover hidden scars, awaken long-buried grief, and begin a journey of redemption so powerful it would change not just a man, but a boy, and a family torn apart. The wind came down off the crazy mountains like something with a memory, cold enough to make eyes water and old fences sing. Behind the stockyards at Cold Creek Livestock Market, coffee steamed in paper cups, and breath hung in thin white ribbons. Men leaned their elbows on the pipe rails, hands tucked into canvas coats, hats pulled low. The auctioneer's voice ran like a creek over stones, fast, bright, then sudden shallows of silence, while hooves clattered on planks and a young hand swung gates as if he'd been born doing it. Henry Callahan stood a little apart from the knot of bidders, boots sunk in thawing mud, a shoulder pressed to a post that had leaned for years. 62. With a Marine's posture that age could bend but not break, he kept his jaw shaved and his words few. He'd put his wedding ring in a sock drawer the day after the funeral because the band bit his finger whenever the weather turned, and Montana, in March, had a way of turning on a man. He didn't come to buy, not really. He'd driven down from the bench above the river because staying home meant counting quiets. The long one at the kitchen table, the heavier one in the hallway where a boy's jacket used to hang. The ring boss waved a hand and a gate swung. What came in next was less horse than a rumor of one. The shape of a horse after a hard winter, nobody helped him through. Gray as a hearth gone cold, mud matted to his fetlocks. One hip sharper than the other, he stepped short on his left fore. A cloudy veil filmed one eye. He looked at nothing head-on, just past it, the way animals do when hope has taught them not to be seen. A couple of men snorted. "That one's more trouble than pasture," someone said, and laughter rose like steam. A teenage kid in a nylon jacket tried to catch the horse's nose with the lead. The horse didn't rear and didn't fight, just went thin and rigid, muscles drawn tight as wire under skin. "Lot 19, the auctioneer sang, the chant bright as tinsel. "We'll open at 100. 100, who'll give me 100 for this gelding? Good age, good bone? Need a little feed on him, folks, a little feed and shoeing. 100, do I hear 100? Silence widened. Boots scuffed. The kid on the gate pretended interest in a hangnail. Henry watched the gray because he couldn't not. Something about the set of the ears, alert but flattened in to save themselves, struck him. He knew that posture. He'd seen it in men fresh back from places that had no right to exist, and in the mirror, too, the winter. His youngest boy didn't come home from the coulee. Bright blaze of a hat lost in snow, a rifle's echo running miles. The gray flicked an ear toward the chant, toward the crowd's heat, then back to its unchosen distance. 100, the man called again, softer now, almost pitying. Henry raised 2 fingers. It surprised even him, the way his hand moved like he'd been answering a roll call. Heads turned. Somebody chuckled, not unkind. "I got 100, the chant picked up, grateful. "Got 100 looking for 1 1/4, 1 1/4, now 25? 25? He searched the faces and found only amusement there. "Sold," he said, the gavel's crack small and absolute. "To the gentleman in the brown coat." Henry didn't feel like a gentleman. He felt the way a man feels when he puts his palm on a stove that isn't lit, alive to heat that's not there yet. He went to the office, and peeled $100 bill from his wallet, the green soft from passing back and forth over years. The cashier, a woman with a braid so tight it shone, tore a receipt and slid it over with a nod that said nothing about sense or its lack. The red stamp bled through the thin paper. Paid. In the back alley of the yards, the wind smelled of manure and damp straw and the machine oil they used to keep the gates from screaming. Henry took a halter from his truck, found the gray in a corner pen. Up close, the horse smelled like wet cardboard and old fear. He stood very still, not cowering, not coming, just becoming absence. Henry let the halter hang loose at his side. He didn't talk to the horse. Some men did. He never found words that seemed honest enough. He let his breath find its own pace. After a while, the gray blinked. A shallow sigh moved through his ribs. Henry raised the halter a little, slow, as if pulling a story from the bottom of a lake, and the horse flinched, but didn't bolt. The buckle clicked. The sound was too loud. Loading should have been a rodeo with a horse like this. It wasn't. The gelding studied the dark rectangle of the trailer and set a hoof on the ramp, as if setting it into a new life might be a sin. He hesitated just long enough to test the future, then stepped up. Henry swung the butt bar, latched the door, and felt the small relief of a thing done that nobody could undo. He checked the tie, checked it again, then stood a moment with his hand on the aluminum skin. Through the thin metal he could feel the horse breathing. He could feel, too, his own chest moving to match it, as if two clocks were trying, awkwardly, to keep time. The two-lane home ran straight through barley stubble and winter wheat, past cottonwoods with last year's leaves rattling like paper bags. The radio stayed off. The tires hissed over wet patches where snow had gone to melt and frozen again. Pit houses slumped low to the ground. Windbreaks leaned. Blue tarps snapped and banged on the backs of woodpiles, hitun. Past a boy dragging a sled through mud, a woman shouldering a sack of feed that looked 15 pounds too much for her. When a freight rolled by on the other side of the river, Henry lifted 2 fingers off the wheel. He didn't know why. Maybe because nobody can watch a long train alone. Maybe because grief has its own small salutes. At the last rise, the land opened, and his place lay below like a sentence that needed finishing. The house wore its paint like a memory. The barn sagged on one corner where last spring's thaw had beaten the frost out of the footings. Fences ran crooked to the hill, wire snaggled where deer had made their choices. He stopped the truck by the paddock behind the house. The cottonwood there had a scar like a lightning bolt down its trunk, healed into something smooth. His wife used to hang a rope swing in that scar. When the wind was right, he could still hear it creak. He didn't lead the gray to the barn. He swung the paddock gate wide and stepped aside, like a man opening the door to a church he doesn't believe in anymore. The horse paused on the trailer lip, sniffed the air that blew down from the haystack and across a salt block furred with old snow. He stepped out. The soil was soft, and he felt it the way you feel a mattress the first night in a motel that belongs to no one and to you for as long as your name is on the slip. Henry set a tub under the hydrant and watched the water climb the rim. He forked hay from a bale so dry it crackled, flakes breaking along their seams. He laid it down by the fence, but far from corners where traps happen. The horse kept his distance like a man sitting on the far side of a diner booth, so that leaving is a straight line. When Henry unhooked the lead, the rope fell with a small dust of grit from the snap. He took the halter off and put it in his back pocket, not sure why he didn't hang it. He walked away with what he hoped looked like indifference and what felt like prayer. Afternoon crept sideways into evening. Cold cut a new edge in the wind. He went inside and filled the old percolator, the one with a handle gone loose. He set it on the stove and stared while coffee blinked its brown eye at him. He poured it black, carried the cup outside, and settled onto the porch step where paint had worn down to the wood. The cup's heat went quick. Across the yard, the gray stood with his head high, ears playing the sky for danger. Somewhere cows bawled. Somewhere a dog answered himself. It would have been easy to make the horse a story. People did that, Henry knew. Pasted meaning onto muscle and will, called it healing because a certain kind of hurt needs a hymn. He didn't have a hymn left in him. What he had was $100 lighter in his wallet and a thin, peculiar sense that buying that horse had nudged the world a degree. Hardly anything, but when you're a long way out, a degree can mean a different shore. The gray dropped his head. He didn't eat at first. He breathed into the hay, sifted scent out of it like a man pulling a letter from a drawer and smelling the paper to decide what year it was. He took a bite, small as a courtesy. He chewed. The line of his back softened a fraction. He shifted his weight off the sore leg for a heartbeat, then back. His tail flicked once at a sound Henry couldn't hear. An evening train moaned in the distance, long and low, a sound that used to send his son running to count cars. He pictured the boy's red cap bounding along the fence, hand slapping posts as if waking them. The memory was as clear as it had ever been, and hurt no less for that clarity. He set the coffee down and laced his fingers together like a man about to speak to someone he couldn't see. He should have thought about tomorrow, about the farrier he hadn't called in years, the vet whose bills came with their own weather, the hay that had wintered badly under a tarp the wind kept making into a sail. He should have wondered who owned that horse before the auction did. What brand lay under the mud? What paperwork didn't follow him? He didn't. He watched the gray work through another careful mouthful. He noticed the small notch in the near ear, neat as if a knife had made a choice there. He noticed a patch of hair on the shoulder grown back in a white map, the shape of a handprint gone long. Night doesn't fall on the high plains, so much as it unthreads itself through every fence and dead weed. Stars came in their old places, but the sky near town smudged up a shade, a reminder that other people were drawing curtains, clattering pans, living lives in rooms with light. The horse turned once, slow, and set himself facing the house. It wasn't trust. It wasn't anything a man could brag on. It felt like permission to remain. When the cold began to find the seams in Henry's coat, he stood and stretched until his spine popped. The kitchen lamp threw a small square onto the porch boards, and moths came to argue with it. He went in and set the cup by the sink and stood stupidly looking at the empty chair on the other side of the table, as if it had something to tell him, and had chosen not to. Back on the porch, he pulled the collar up around his neck and found the horse with his eyes in the dark. The gray was exactly where he'd been, but he looked different in the thin light, less like a mistake, more like a promise nobody had spoken yet. Names came and went in Henry's head, the way they do when a man tries to grasp a thing by holding it too tight. He thought of the color of stove ash in the mornings, how it keeps a heat under itself. Even when the fire looks dead, he kept that thought and let the name slide away. Some things are only true when you say them once, and he wasn't ready to say anything. A coyote called down in the coulee. Another answered farther off, and the gray flicked an ear but didn't move his feet. Henry felt the strange mercy of that, of an animal choosing stillness in a world that had taught him to do otherwise. The receipt in his pocket crinkled when he sat down again. He took it out and smoothed it on his knee, tracing the red paid with a thumb. $100. It wasn't the price of a horse. It was the price of admission, maybe, to a story that would cost what it cost and refuse to be tallied. He stayed until the coffee in the cup turned into a skin, and the house breathed its empty breaths behind him. The gray raised his head once and blinked slow. Henry lifted a hand, a small, foolish greeting. It might have been the breeze, it might have been nothing, but the horse's ears tipped forward, and for the first time since Henry had seen him, he looked straight at the man and didn't look away. Morning light crept across the Montana benchland with the kind of hesitation that belongs to early spring. A pale sun pushed through thin clouds, touching the frosted grass with a shimmer that burned away as quick as breath. Henry Callahan pulled his coat tighter and stepped off the porch, boots crunching over gravel that had seen more winters than he cared to count. The cold had a bite, but it was the silence that pressed hardest. Silence broken only by the creak of the cottonwood and the soft whicker of a horse learning the edges of a new world. Ash stood near the far corner of the paddock, ribs showing beneath a coat that should have gleamed, but instead dulled to the color of ashes from a fire long gone. He had not moved much since last night. His hooves were planted as though the earth itself might betray him if he lifted them. One cloudy eye caught the light and turned it back empty. The other, dark and sharp, tracked Henry with the weary calculation of something that had survived too much. Henry rested both hands on the fence rail. He didn't speak. Words had always been a poor tool for him, and since the funeral they'd felt like stones in his mouth. He simply watched. The horse flicked an ear, uncertain, and blew a small breath through his nose. The sound was barely more than the sigh of the wind, but Henry felt it like a message. He let the moment sit, long and quiet, until his own lungs matched the rhythm. The paddock behind the house wasn't much. Fence wire sagged in places, and the soil near the gate was churned from years of hooves long gone. But the cottonwood tree still stood, scarred and broad, its roots drinking from the underground vein that never dried. His youngest son had once tied a rope swing there, laughter echoing across the yard until the sound folded into memory. Now, beneath that same tree, Ash stood as still as any monument, a shadow cut from the land itself. Henry fetched a bucket from the hydrant, water splashing cold across his knuckles. He set it near the fence, not too close, not forcing anything. Then he laid down a flake of hay, the kind that broke apart with the sound of paper tearing. The smell of dry grass carried on the breeze, sweet but faint, and Ash turned his head slightly, nostrils twitching. It was the first movement with purpose Henry had seen. The horse stepped forward half a pace, hesitated, then stopped as if permission had to be earned. All through the morning, Henry worked small chores, the kind that didn't matter but filled the hours. He patched a section of roof on the chicken shed that no longer housed chickens. He checked the tractor that hadn't started in 2 years. He stacked firewood, though the worst of winter was already gone. Each time he glanced toward the paddock, the horse was there, unmoved, except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. By afternoon, the clouds thickened and the wind turned sharp. Henry poured himself coffee and carried it back to the porch, the enamel mug warm against his palm. Across the yard, Ash finally lowered his head. He touched the hay with his lips, tested it like a man testing a lock, then took a mouthful. Henry exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders in a rush. Something inside him shifted. Quiet, almost invisible but real. Evening settled with the smell of damp earth. Coyotes began to tune their voices in the coulee below. Ash stood alone in the fading light, the outline of his ribs catching shadow, but now his head was bent to the ground, chewing. The sound was soft, steady, and in it Henry heard the fragile beginning of trust. He sat until the coffee cooled, until his fingers numbed in the night air, watching the horse who had been forgotten by everyone else, and yet, somehow, had found his way here. When he finally rose, joints stiff, he paused one last time at the doorway. Ash lifted his head and turned, both eyes fixing on him. Not for long, but long enough. In that brief crossing of gazes, Henry felt something he hadn't allowed in years. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the outline of it, faint as the first star in a cold sky. That night the ranch held its silence differently. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The house smelled of old wood smoke and loneliness. Even after a year, the absence of Martha clung to every room like dust that wouldn't sweep away. Henry sat at the table that night, the same oak table he and his wife had bought when they were first married, scarred by decades of meals and arguments and birthdays. Across from him, the chair remained empty. It was never filled now, though sometimes he caught himself glancing toward it, as if waiting for her to walk in with her apron dusted in flour, scolding him for forgetting to wash up before supper. The lamp hummed. The wind dragged its hand across the siding. Henry wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee, gone cold hours ago, and stared at the window's dark reflection. He saw his own face, carved with lines deeper than his years should have allowed. Behind that face hovered memory. Martha's laughter, their son's boots pounding down the hallway, the smell of venison stew in the fall. The reflection blurred and became someone else, a younger man with fire in his shoulders. Henry blinked, and he was alone again. Outside, the horse Ash shifted. The faint sound of hooves in dirt traveled through the glass like an echo from some other world. Henry rose and stepped to the porch. The night air was crisp enough to sting. He pulled his coat close, the collar brushing his jaw, and leaned against the rail. Ash stood beneath the cottonwood, head lowered, one ear cocked toward the house. His coat caught moonlight in patches, the scars along his flank making pale streaks. Henry remembered another night, many winters back. His youngest boy, Daniel, had begged to go hunting. The snow had been deep, the sky low. Henry could still see Daniel's red cap bobbing between drifts, hear the laughter that chased away cold. He could still hear the rifle crack, sharp, then another sound, less a shot than a scream swallowed by distance. When they found him, it was already too late. A misstep, a slip, and the rifle had gone off in his hands. 15 years old. Henry had carried his son's body through snow so deep his legs burned with every step. He had never forgiven himself, though no one else had blamed him. Now, standing in the dark, he felt the weight of that memory settle again on his shoulders. Ash lifted his head and looked at him, the one good eye gleaming, the other clouded like glass smoked over. Something in that look tugged at Henry's chest. It was the same emptiness he carried, the same hollow where trust should have lived. He whispered Daniel's name before he realized it. The word carried off into the night, thin as smoke. Ash flicked an ear and shifted his stance, not away, not closer, just there, holding still as though he understood. Henry swallowed hard, the ache rising until it pressed behind his eyes. Back inside, he pulled a photo album from the shelf, one he hadn't opened in years. Dust lifted into the light like spirits. The first page showed Martha in her wedding dress, squinting against the sun, his arms stiff around her waist. Page after page held birthdays, fishing trips, harvest suppers. Then Daniel, first steps, first calf roped, first deer. Henry's hands trembled as he traced the image of the boy's smile, forever 15, frozen in the frame. He shut the book, the sound sharp, and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling beams. The silence pressed again, but this time it wasn't only empty. It was shared, somehow, with the horse outside. When dawn came, Henry was already awake. He pushed the door open and stepped into the pale light. Frost silvered the ground. Ash still stood near the cottonwood, unmoving, as if the night hadn't passed at all. The horse's breath plumed in the air, slow, steady. Henry felt his own chest rise in time. He fetched hay and dropped it by the trough. Ash turned his head, nostrils flaring, and after a long pause stepped forward, thin legs stiff but determined. Henry didn't reach out. He simply stood, coffee steaming in his hand, while the horse lowered his head to eat. For the first time since Daniel's death, Henry felt the faintest stirring of something he thought he'd buried forever. It wasn't peace, not yet. It wasn't even forgiveness. But it was presence. Another soul broken in ways different and the same, standing with him in the pale light of morning. The echoes of loss hadn't left him. They never would. But in the sound of a horse chewing hay, in the slow blink of a clouded eye, Henry heard something new begin to answer back. The bus rumbled away in a cough of black exhaust, leaving dust to hang in the chill Montana air. Henry stood at the end of the gravel drive, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, staring at the thin figure that had stepped off with nothing but a backpack and a look too old for 14 years. The boy's name was Eli Turner. His mother, a woman Henry barely knew from town, had pressed the matter in a hurried phone call the night before. "Just for a while," she'd said. "I've got things I need to sort out." She hadn't given details. Henry hadn't asked. He never asked anymore. Eli kicked at a stone, his sneakers caked in mud from somewhere else. His hair hung long over his forehead, and his eyes flicked to the house, the barn, the horse pen, then away as if cataloging disappointments. Henry felt his jaw set. He wasn't ready for this, for a boy dropped on his doorstep when the rooms inside still whispered with ghosts. But there Eli was, and Henry, being who he was, wouldn't turn him away. "Got a room upstairs," Henry said flatly. His voice cracked from disuse. "Second door on the right. You'll find it." The boy shrugged, hitched his backpack higher, and started up the porch steps without a word. The screen door banged behind him. Henry stayed outside a long while, listening to the distant crows and the slow creak of the cottonwood. He hadn't asked for company. He hadn't wanted it. Yet company had arrived. By late afternoon, the ranch had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Henry chopped wood, though the stack was already high. Eli drifted in and out of the house, silent, sometimes thumbing through a dog-eared comic, sometimes staring out the window toward the paddock. When Henry noticed the direction of that stare, he felt something tighten in his chest. Ash still stood apart, ribs sharp against his skin, the winter sun catching the scars on his flank. He hadn't moved much since the morning. Eli pressed his face to the glass, eyes narrowing, and for a moment Henry recognized something in that look. Curiosity tempered by caution, the instinct of the wounded. Near dusk, Henry stepped outside with a bucket of water. The air smelled of damp hay and wood smoke. He set the bucket by the fence and leaned on the rail. Behind him, the door creaked. Eli hovered in the doorway, thin arms crossed, a defiance covering the uncertainty underneath. "You ever been around horses?" Henry asked. The boy shook his head. "Mom said, they're dangerous." Henry almost smiled, though it didn't reach his mouth. "So's just about everything worth knowing." He nodded toward the paddock. "That one's name's Ash. Don't spook him." Eli stepped down onto the porch, slow, like the boards might give way beneath him. He walked across the yard, sneakers crunching frost, and stopped at the fence. Ash lifted his head, ears twitching. For a moment, both boy and horse froze, measuring each other in the dim light. Eli raised a hand halfway, then dropped it awkwardly. Henry watched from the porch, breath held. Ash didn't retreat. Instead, he shifted his weight, turned his clouded eye toward the boy, and stood still. The space between them seemed to hum, fragile but undeniable. That night, supper passed in silence. Henry fried potatoes and eggs, set them on the table. Eli ate with quick, sharp movements, never looking up. When he was done, he pushed back his chair and muttered, "Thanks." It was the first word he'd spoken since stepping off the bus. Henry nodded, but inside he felt a stir, faint as wind through brittle grass. Later, as Henry stepped onto the porch with his coffee, he saw Eli again by the fence line. The boy's shoulders hunched against the cold, his breath fogging white. Ash stood a few feet away, head lowered. The boy whispered something Henry couldn't catch. Whatever it was, the horse didn't bolt. He only flicked an ear, then dropped his nose closer to the frost-hardened ground. Henry turned back to the house, leaving them to their silence. The boy was unwelcome, yes, but he was here. And already, in ways Henry couldn't yet name, the three of them, man, boy, and broken horse, were bound by threads of hurt that might, just might, be strong enough to weave into something else. The morning came with a pale wash of light over the valley, soft and uncertain, like it hadn't decided whether to stay. Henry rose early, the habit of years dragging him out of bed long before the boy stirred. He brewed coffee, the smell filling the kitchen and climbing the stairs. The old house creaked with the sounds of settling, its bones shifting in the cold. From the porch he could see Ash, standing in the same patch of earth he'd chosen days before. Head low, tail barely flicking. The horse had eaten some of the hay, but not much, and the water bucket held a thin skin of ice. He carried a flake of hay to the trough and broke it apart with his hands, letting the dust of it rise around him. Ash lifted his head, but didn't move closer, only watched with that clouded eye, unreadable and patient. Henry left the hay and turned back, his boots crunching frost. When he glanced at the window of the house, he caught sight of Eli watching, arms folded on the sill, face hidden behind the glass. By late afternoon, the air softened, clouds pulling apart to reveal a sharp slice of blue. Henry was mending a gate hinge when he noticed Eli slip from the porch. The boy walked, slowly, shoulders hunched, his sneakers dark with mud. He stopped at the fence, fingers gripping the wire, eyes fixed on the horse. Ash stood still, ears pricked forward, the wind carrying the smell of hay and boy sweat. Henry straightened, but didn't call out. Something in the scene felt too fragile for sound. Eli took a step closer, moving along the fence until he was near the gate. His hand hesitated above the latch. Trembling with both fear and a kind of hunger Henry recognized all too well. The hunger to touch something alive and not be rejected. Ash shifted, hooves thudding softly. But he didn't bolt. He watched the boy with a stillness that was neither trust nor refusal. Eli swallowed hard, then slid the latch. The metal clicked like a gun hammer in the quiet. He slipped inside, 1 foot in the dirt of the paddock. Henry held his breath. He had seen broken horses lash out without warning, seen fear explode into violence. But Ash only turned his head, body tense yet unmoving. Eli raised his hand halfway, palm open, his voice breaking in a whisper. "Hey." It wasn't much, just a sound, but it carried something fragile, plea and promise mixed together. The horse flinched, muscles tightening, then stilled. The boy inched forward, boots dragging through straw. Ash dropped his head slightly, nostrils flaring. For a long moment they faced each other, 2 creatures balanced between flight and surrender. Then, as if some unseen wire slackened, Ash took a step closer. Eli froze, eyes wide, breath sharp. His hand shook as he stretched it forward, stopping just short of the horse's muzzle. The distance between skin and fur seemed charged, alive. Finally, Ash closed the gap himself, brushing his nose against the boy's fingers. The touch was brief, no more than a second, but it landed heavy in the air. Eli gasped softly, a sound almost like relief. From the porch, Henry felt something shift in his chest. He had tried to reach the horse for days, had stood silent by the fence, offering hay, water, time. And yet it was the boy, angry, abandoned, full of restless edges, who broke through first. Henry should have felt envy. Instead, he felt the faintest flicker of gratitude. A light so small it barely glowed, but enough to warm a corner of his chest that had been cold too long. Eli withdrew his hand slowly, careful not to startle the horse. Ash stayed where he was, ears flicking, breathing hard but steady. The boy whispered again, words Henry couldn't hear. And the horse seemed to listen, his head lowering another inch, his body no longer strung so tight. When Eli finally stepped back, Ash didn't retreat. He stood his ground, watching the boy until he reached the gate again. Eli latched it behind him and turned toward the house, face blank, but eyes burning with something Henry hadn't seen before, something dangerously close to hope. At supper, the boy didn't speak of it. He shoveled potatoes into his mouth and drank his milk without comment. But his glance strayed more than once to the window, where darkness lay heavy outside. Henry didn't ask. He wasn't sure what words could hold the weight of what had happened. Later that night, when the lamps were out and the house quiet, Henry stepped onto the porch again. The stars spread hard and cold above, the cottonwood whispering in the wind. Out in the paddock, Ash stood closer to the house than usual, near the gate where the boy had been. His breath fogged the air, steady and calm. Henry watched for a long time, coffee cooling in his hands. He thought of Daniel, of the swing that had once hung from the tree, of the laughter that had filled the air and then gone silent. Now, another boy's voice had carried across the yard. Another boy's hand had reached out, and somehow the world had shifted once more. For the first time in years, Henry let out a long breath and felt it carry more than just air. It carried memory, sorrow, and the fragile beginning of something new. Out in the paddock, the forgotten horse had allowed a touch, and with it, perhaps, a door had opened that none of them knew was still there. The sun climbed slow over the ridge that morning, pale and thin through a veil of drifting clouds. Henry stepped out with a brush in his hand, the same stiff-backed tool he had used on countless horses in younger days. His boots carried him to the paddock without thought, as if his body had chosen the path before his mind. Ash stood in the center, head down, ribs outlined in the slant of light. He looked carved from the dust, a creature caught between shadow and bone. Henry rested a forearm on the gate. The brush hung loose at his side, its bristles worn, handle smooth from years of use. He didn't call the horse. He simply stood until the air between them softened. Slowly, carefully, he stepped inside. Ash shifted, muscles tightening like rope, ears flicking back, then forward again. Henry spoke no word, offered no command, only moved with the kind of patience that had come late in life and heavy with regret. When he finally raised the brush, Ash tensed, eyes widening. Henry waited, hand steady in the air, until the horse's breathing slowed. Then he reached out, pressing the bristles against the shoulder in a firm, even stroke. Dust rose like smoke. Beneath the dirt lay not just hair, but a map of scars. Long white lines where skin had broken, ridges where wounds had closed hard. Some were shallow, others deep enough to tell of years lived in cruelty. Henry froze, his throat tight. His palm shook against the wood of the handle. He knew marks like these, not from animals, but from men. He had seen them on Marines who came home broken, who flinched at sudden sound, who woke screaming in the night. He had felt the same weight on his own soul, hidden where no eye could trace it. The pain written into Ash's hide was too familiar, too close. Ash shivered, but didn't step away. He endured the touch, eyes flicking toward Henry as if weighing the man's intent. Henry held the stroke, steady, brushing dirt and memory away one layer at a time. The sound of it was soft, rhythmic, almost a lullaby against the harsh silence of the land. With each pass of the brush, more of the scars revealed themselves, pale lines crossing over ribs, a patch near the flank where hair grew uneven, a welt across the chest that spoke of chains. Henry's chest ached. He thought of Martha, how she used to say love was not loud, but steady, how she had believed healing was in the small, repeated acts, a hand on a shoulder, a meal at the table, the quiet showing up each day. He had not understood then. He did now, standing beside a horse who bore his history on his skin. A sound behind him drew his attention. Eli stood at the fence, arms folded, watching. The boy's face was unreadable, but his eyes clung to every movement of brush over hide. When Henry glanced at him, Eli's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, voice low and rough. "He's been hurt," the boy said, as if the words cost him something. Henry nodded once. "Yeah." For a long moment they both stood silent, the air thick with unspoken things. Then Eli shifted, his gaze still fixed on the horse. "So was I," he whispered, barely more than breath. The words slipped out like a confession, brittle and raw. Henry felt them land heavy between them. He didn't ask. He didn't push. He only returned his hand to the horse, steady, as if to show that scars, whether flesh or soul, could still be tended. Ash lowered his head, the tightness in his body easing just enough to let the brush travel further along his side. Dust and hair clung to Henry's coat, the air filled with the dry, earthy smell of old neglect. When at last the horse shifted and exhaled, it felt like surrender, not of fear, but of the need to keep standing guard. That night Henry sat on the porch, coffee cooling in his hands. Out in the paddock, Ash lay down for the first time since arriving. The sight made Henry's chest ache in ways he could not name. A horse does not lie down unless it feels safe. And in that small act, Henry saw a glimmer of something precious. He glanced toward the upstairs window where Eli's shadow moved behind the curtain. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt less alone in his grief. The scars that bound them, man, boy, and horse, were still there, but beneath the quiet Montana sky, they no longer seemed like endings. They seemed like beginnings written in lines no cruelty could erase. The days stretched thin and cold, stitched together by routine. Henry woke before dawn, brewed coffee, and stepped out to the paddock where Ash now met him halfway, ears pricked but wary. Each morning the distance closed by inches, a fragile negotiation between fear and trust. Eli sometimes joined, shoulders hunched in his oversized jacket, eyes still sleepy but fixed on the horse like he was trying to read secrets written in the air. The boy said little, yet his silence was different from Henry's. Where Henry's silence carried the weight of years, Eli's seemed like armor, brittle but necessary. One evening, while searching the shed for a tool, Eli stumbled upon a battered trunk shoved into a corner beneath rusted tack and coils of rope. Curiosity flared in the boy's eyes as he pried it open. Inside lay a scattering of old photographs, their edges curled with time, the colors fading. He pulled one free, brushing off dust. The image showed a much younger Henry standing proud beside a chestnut mare, Martha smiling just behind them. The horse's stance was regal, her coat gleaming under the summer sun. On the back of the photograph, in Martha's tidy script, was written, "Willow, 1998. Eli carried it to Henry without a word, holding it out like proof of something he hadn't understood yet. Henry's breath caught when he saw it. The years peeled back in an instant. He remembered Willow's strength, the way she'd run the fence line with Daniel's laughter chasing her. She had vanished one stormy night, stolen or lost. He never knew. Henry stared at the picture, then at Ash, standing in the paddock beyond the window. The resemblance was uncanny, the same proud neck, the same blaze across the face, though dulled now by scars and sorrow. "That's her," Henry muttered, voice hoarse. "Or damned near," Eli frowned. "You think he's hers?" Henry shook his head slowly. "Could be. Looks it. But without papers, a horse is just a shadow." His eyes stayed on Ash, searching, measuring. Something old and unsettled stirred in his chest. The following morning, Henry found an envelope nailed to the barn door. The paper was damp from dew, the handwriting jagged and impatient. He tugged it free, unfolded it with stiff fingers. 5 words, scrawled in black ink. Return the horse, or regret it. He read it twice, the words sinking like stones. His gut tightened with the old instincts of a man who had lived through darker days. He glanced toward the house, toward the boy sleeping upstairs, then back to the paddock where Ash stood, ears swiveling in the wind. Someone wanted the horse back badly enough to leave threats on his land. Henry crumpled the note in his fist, then smoothed it out again. He slid it into his pocket and said nothing when Eli came down for breakfast. The boy ate quickly, unaware, but Henry's eyes lingered on him. He thought of scars hidden beneath sleeves, of confessions whispered in the dark. Protecting the boy was one thing. Protecting the horse, another. But now the two were tangled, bound together in ways Henry hadn't expected. Later that day, Eli returned to the paddock with the photograph tucked in his pocket. He stood at the fence, showing it to Ash as if the horse might recognize his own bloodline. "Was she your mama?" he whispered, voice trembling. The horse flicked an ear, nostrils quivering, and Eli smiled faintly as though the silence itself were an answer. From the porch, Henry watched them. He thought of Martha's handwriting on the back of that photo, of Willow's disappearance, of how quickly something precious could be stolen. The threat still burned in his pocket, but stronger than fear was the conviction taking root in him. Whatever past Ash carried, it was his now. The horse was no longer a forgotten thing sold for $100. He was part of this place, part of their story. And Henry, scarred and weary, would not give him back. That night the wind whistled through the cracks of the house, rattling the windows. Henry lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. He imagined strangers moving through the dark, imagined chains clinking against Ash's hide, imagined Eli waking to find the paddock empty. His fists clenched against the sheets. Loss had lived here long enough. He would not let it take root again. Beyond the walls, Ash shifted in the paddock, blowing softly into the night air. It was not a sound of fear, but of endurance, the steady rhythm of survival. Henry closed his eyes and listened, the note heavy in his pocket, the photograph heavy in his memory. Both whispered of a past that refused to stay buried, and of a future now tied to the fragile breath of a boy and a broken horse. The weather broke in strange ways over the valley. Spring should have softened the edges, but instead the wind sharpened, clouds piling on the horizon like soldiers massing for battle. Henry felt it in his bones before he saw it in the sky, the old ache that came when something was coming, something more than rain. He rose earlier than usual, moving slow through the morning, his hands restless with chores that didn't need doing. Eli trailed him into the barn, carrying nails in one pocket, hammer in the other. The boy's presence had become a quiet constant, not quite welcome but not unwelcome either, like the smell of wood smoke that lingers in old beams. Henry didn't speak of the note he had found on the barn door days before. It lay folded in his wallet, edges damp from being opened and smoothed too many times. He had lived long enough to know that trouble doesn't vanish when ignored. Trouble waits. Ash stood in the paddock, no longer rooted to one patch of ground, but pacing slow arcs along the fence line. His body had filled out some with steady hay, the sharpness of bone dulled by new muscle. Yet his scars showed clearer in the bright light, pale against the gray of his coat. He lifted his head when Eli approached, ears flicking, and stepped forward until his muzzle brushed the boy's sleeve. Henry saw the boy's face soften, the hard mask cracking just enough to reveal how much he needed that trust. That evening, Henry drove into town. The truck's engine rattled down Main Street, past shuttered shops, and the single diner with its neon light buzzing against dusk. He parked outside the sheriff's office, a small brick building that leaned a little underseen, its own age. Sheriff Cole sat behind his desk, boots propped on a drawer, hat tilted back. He looked up, his weathered face breaking into something like surprise. "Callahan," he said, straightening. "Been a long time." Henry nodded once. "Got something you ought to see." He slid the note across the desk. Cole picked it up, reading the scrawled words twice before setting it down again. His brow furrowed. "Any idea who left it?" "No." Henry's voice was low, steady. "But they want that horse." Cole leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight. "Word is, there's been a ring moving stock through this county. Not just stolen horses, bloodlines, the kind folks pay thousands for under the table. Could be your animal's got more value than you figured." Henry's jaw tightened. "He's mine now." Cole studied him a moment, then nodded. "Keep your eyes open. If they want him bad enough to threaten, they'll come looking. I'll ask around." When Henry returned home, dusk had thickened into night. Eli was waiting on the porch steps, arms wrapped around his knees. "Where'd you go?" the boy asked, voice edged with suspicion. "Town." Henry brushed past, setting his hat on the hook by the door. He didn't explain further. Eli frowned but said nothing. The storm arrived in the night. Rain hammered the roof, wind rattled the loose siding, the cottonwood groaned under the weight of it. Henry sat at the table, lamp burning low, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Boots on gravel, gates clanging. The note burned in his thoughts. Upstairs, Eli turned in his sleep, muttering through whatever shadows chased him. Out in the paddock, Ash stood against the weather, his body a dark silhouette in the lightning flash. By morning, branches littered the yard, the ground slick with mud. The sky was clearer, but the unease remained, heavier than the storm itself. Henry carried coffee to the porch, watching as Eli joined Ash by the fence, the boy's hand resting on the horse's scarred neck. It was a picture of fragile peace, but Henry knew better than to trust the calm. The storm was not gone. It had only shifted shape. The gathering wasn't just in the sky anymore. It was in the land, in the boy's wary eyes, in the horse's restless pacing, and in Henry's own chest where old instincts stirred awake. Something was coming, and when it did, silence and scars would no longer be enough to keep them safe. The night had a weight to it, heavy and strange, as though the valley itself were holding its breath. The air was sharp with the smell of damp earth left behind by the storm, and the sky glowed faintly green in places where clouds still clung to the horizon. Henry sat on the porch with his rifle propped against the wall beside him, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He told himself he was awake because of the storm's aftermath, because the barn roof still needed fixing, or because the dog down the road had been barking too long. But deep down, he knew it was something else, the prickling certainty that danger had not passed with the rain. Inside the house, Eli stirred in his bed, tossing and turning against dreams that never seemed to give him rest. The boy muttered in his sleep, the words too faint to catch, the tone sharp with fear. Out in the paddock, Ash shifted uneasily, hooves striking against wet ground, ears pricked toward the dark line of cottonwoods. Henry noticed, setting his cup aside, his breath caught halfway. The night was too quiet, broken only by that restless movement. Then came the sound, faint at first, like a twig snapping. Henry stiffened, his hand closing around the rifle stock. Another noise followed, the unmistakable screech of metal strained beyond its strength. The padlock on the gate clattered, cut clean. His stomach turned cold. Whoever it was, they hadn't come to talk. Ash snorted, backing up toward the far end of the paddock, his body tensed like a bowstring. Henry stood and leveled the rifle as shadows moved along the fence. Two figures slipped inside, their shapes jagged in the moonlight. One carried a rope coiled at his side, the other a metal bar glinting faintly. Their movements were confident, practiced, the kind of men who had done this before. Henry's voice cut through the night. "That's far enough." The men froze. One spat into the dirt, his face hidden under a bandana. "Ain't your horse, old man. Best step aside." Henry steadied the barrel. "He's mine now, paid in cash. You want him, you'll have to take him from me." The taller man took a step forward, rope in hand. "Don't matter what you paid. Belongs to someone else." Behind Henry, the door banged open. Eli burst out onto the porch, barefoot, eyes wide with panic. "Henry?" His voice cracked with fear, but when he saw the men in the paddock, his expression hardened. Without thinking, he ran toward Ash, arms spread as though to shield the horse with his own thin frame. "Get back, boy!" Henry barked, but Eli didn't stop. He ducked under the fence and planted himself between the horse and the intruders. Ash shifted behind him, nostrils flaring, his massive body quivering with tension. The intruders hesitated. The man with the crowbar lifted it, not toward Eli, but toward the horse. The boy's voice rang out, trembling but fierce. "You'll have to go through me first." The defiance in that small voice cut through Henry's chest. He stepped forward, finger tightening on the trigger. "Leave. Now." But before the standoff could break, Ash exploded into motion. The horse lunged, teeth bared, hooves pounding the ground with thunder. He barreled into the man with the rope, knocking him flat into the mud. The crowbar swung wide, missing its mark as the second intruder stumbled. Eli darted aside, heart hammering, while Ash reared, striking the earth with enough force to shake the fence posts. Henry fired into the air, the crack of the rifle splitting the night like lightning. The sound rolled across the valley, echoing back from the hills. The intruders scrambled, one clutching his side, the other dragging his companion to his feet. Without another word, they fled into the tree line, swallowed by the dark. Silence rushed back, broken only by the sound of Ash's heavy breathing. His body trembled, sweat streaking through the dust of his coat, but he stood tall, head high, ears pinned forward like a sentinel. Eli stumbled toward him, tears bright on his face, and threw his arms around the horse's scarred neck. "It's okay," he whispered again and again, his voice shaking. "You're safe now. We won't let them take you." Henry lowered the rifle, his hands trembling. He had seen battles before, but this one was different. This was fought not for land or duty, but for a boy and a horse bound together by wounds the world had carved too deep. He walked into the paddock, laid a hand on Ash's damp shoulder, and met Eli's eyes. The boy's face was streaked with mud and tears, but there was fire there too. A fire Henry hadn't seen in years. Together, they stood in the quiet aftermath, man, boy, and horse. The storm had passed, but another had just begun. And Henry knew, as he felt the heat of Ash's trembling body beneath his palm, that nothing about their lives would ever be simple again. Morning came gray and hollow after the raid. the kind of light that made the land look stripped bare. Henry hadn't slept. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the paddock where Ash stood quietly, his scarred hide damp from the dew. The horse's chest still rose and fell with the memory of the night's violence, but there was a steadiness to him too, a stubborn refusal to collapse. Eli had dragged a blanket out to the barn and refused to leave Ash's side until dawn. The boy now slumped against the fence post, head tipped back, mouth slightly open in uneasy sleep. Henry studied him, the defiance from last night still etched into his thin frame. The yard bore the scars of intrusion, mud churned by boots, the padlock split and tossed aside, fence boards cracked where Ash had struck. Henry walked the perimeter, each broken piece another reminder that someone out there wanted the horse badly enough to risk blood. He bent, picked up the crowbar the intruders had dropped, its edge smeared with dirt. Turning it in his hand, he felt anger coil in his chest. He had buried his temper deep for years, but now it clawed its way back. Raw and hot. Eli stirred when Henry came back to the porch. His eyes were shadowed, dark circles like bruises. He wrapped his arms tight across his chest, as if holding himself together. "They'll come back," he muttered. His voice was flat, not fearful, just certain. Henry sat beside him, laying the crowbar on the step. "Maybe," he said, "but we'll be ready." He wanted to add more, to offer comfort, but words had always been his weakest tool. Instead, he poured coffee into a chipped mug and handed it over. Eli grimaced at the bitterness, but drank anyway, clutching the warmth between his hands. All day, the silence in the house pressed heavy. They worked together repairing the gate, nailing planks into place. Eli held the boards steady, his jaw set tight. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the chill. Henry hammered harder than he needed to, each strike echoing against the valley walls. Neither spoke of the night before, but every glance toward the tree line carried the same thought. Whoever those men were, they hadn't gone far. That evening, while Eli sat sketching in an old notebook, Henry pulled the note from his wallet once more. The words glared up at him, jagged and absolute. "Return the horse, or regret it." He folded it back, slid it into his pocket, then reached for the photo Eli had found. Willow's bright coat shone in the picture, her eyes clear and proud. The likeness to Ash gnawed at him. If this horse was Willow's blood, then someone had worked hard to erase that truth. Henry's mind turned in circles, the old marine discipline warring with the farmer's stubbornness. He should go back to Cole, should tell him what had happened. But he didn't trust law to move quick enough. Didn't trust anyone to understand what this horse had come to mean. Ash wasn't just property. He was proof that survival mattered, even when the world had turned cruel. Later, Henry found Eli outside again, leaning against Ash's side with the brush in hand. The horse stood still, letting the boy work over his scarred hide. Dirt and hair floated into the fading light, the sound of bristles against skin soft and steady. Henry stood watching. Something caught in his throat. Eli spoke without turning. "My stepdad," the boy said quietly. "He used to hit me. Said I was worthless. Mom didn't stop him." The brush slowed in his hand, then continued, stubborn, deliberate. "Guess Ash knows what that's like." Henry closed his eyes, the confession heavy as lead. He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed him again. He stepped closer instead, resting his hand gently on Ash's neck, just above Eli's small hand. The horse flicked an ear but didn't move away. 3 broken creatures, pressed together in silence, holding each other up without knowing how. Night came heavy once more, coyotes yipping on the ridge. Henry sat awake with his rifle across his knees again, Eli curled on the couch under an old quilt, and Ash in the paddock, scars glowing faint in the moonlight. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like a vow, unspoken but binding. Whatever storm was gathering, none of them would face it alone. The days after the raid carried a tension that clung to the ranch like smoke after a fire. Every sound seemed sharper, gravel crunching under tires on the county road, branches snapping in the cottonwoods, the low hum of wind sweeping the valley. Henry kept the rifle closer now, propped against the porch wall even in daylight. Eli stayed near Ash whenever he could, brushing, feeding, talking in whispers that carried across the paddock. The boy seemed to find in the horse something steady, something that didn't vanish when night came. One afternoon, Sheriff Cole's truck rattled up the drive, dust spiraling behind it. He stepped out, his frame still broad despite the weight of years, and tipped his hat toward Henry. "Heard you had trouble," he said, eyes narrowing at the repaired gate and the fresh boards nailed in place. Henry nodded, saying nothing, then handed over the note. Cole read it slow, jaw tightening, and tucked it into his pocket. "You were right," Cole muttered. "There's been talk. An outfit moving horses through Junction County. They're after bloodlines, selling them off like contraband. Wouldn't be surprised if yours is caught up in it." Henry frowned. "He's no prize horse, just a scarred-up gelding." Cole shook his head. "Sometimes it ain't about what they look like now. It's where they come from." Later that night, Henry pulled out the photograph again. Willow's proud stance stared back at him, Martha's handwriting curling across the back. He carried it out to the porch, turning it in the lamplight, then lifted his eyes to Ash in the paddock. The resemblance gnawed at him, undeniable now. He needed more than guesses. He needed proof. The next morning he loaded Ash into the trailer. Eli protested, fear sharp in his voice, but Henry laid a hand on his shoulder. "We're not selling him. Just need answers." The boy climbed into the passenger seat, clutching the photograph tight. The drive into town was quiet, the engine rattling over ruts, the horizon hazy with dust. They pulled up at the small clinic run by Dr. Rebecca Lane, the town's only vet. She was a no-nonsense woman, her hair tied back in a braid, hands always smelling faintly of iodine and hay. She circled Ash slowly, running practiced eyes over his frame. She lifted his lips, checked his teeth, studied the shape of his legs, the slope of his shoulder. "You sure he came from an auction?" she asked finally, brows raised. "That's what they told me," Henry answered. Rebecca's gaze softened. "I'd bet money he's Willow's get. He's got her bone, her gait. Bloodline like that doesn't just vanish." She paused, lowering her voice. "If he's tied to Willow, someone didn't want that known. Papers could have been burned, identities erased. But this horse? He's living proof." Eli's eyes widened, a mix of awe and fear. "So, they want him because of that?" Rebecca nodded. "Exactly. A horse like this isn't just another rescue. He's worth more than most folks around here see in a year. That makes him a target." The weight of her words pressed on Henry all the way home. He watched Ash through the trailers, slats, the horse shifting quietly with each bump of the road. He thought of Martha's handwriting, of the night Willow disappeared, of how many things had been stolen from him and never returned. Now this horse stood in his yard, carrying pieces of that lost past in his blood. That evening, Eli sat on the porch steps with the photograph in his lap. He traced Willow's outline with his finger, then looked toward Ash grazing in the fading light. "He belongs here," the boy said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear still lingering in his eyes. Henry didn't answer right away. He stared at the horse, at the scars that told of cruelty, at the stubborn endurance that kept him alive. For the first time in years, Henry felt the sharp edge of resolve cut through the fog of grief. Ash was more than a stray bought for $100. He was a bloodline someone wanted buried, a thread leading back to a past Henry thought lost. And Henry Callahan knew one thing with absolute certainty. No one would take him again. The road into the valley carried a kind of silence that announced company before it arrived. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and set the fields burning gold, Henry spotted dust rising far down the dirt track. His gut tightened. Visitors were rare, and rarer still unannounced. He wiped his palms on his jeans, a reflex born from nerves he'd rather not admit, and waited. The truck that appeared over the rise was one he knew, though it had been years since he'd seen it. The old Ford slowed as it neared the house, engine coughing before shutting down. When the driver stepped out, Henry felt the weight of time fold back and crush him all at once. Mark Callahan, his eldest, the son who had walked away long before Martha's funeral, the son whose silence had stretched longer than any fence line Henry ever mended. Mark looked older, lines carved deep around his mouth, his eyes shadowed with the same grief Henry carried, but had never spoken. He slammed the door harder than he needed to, standing stiff against the wind. Eli, who had been sketching on the porch, froze at the sight of the stranger. His eyes darted between the two men, sensing the tension before a word was spoken. "Didn't expect you," Henry said finally, voice rough. Mark's jaw worked before he spoke. "I heard you'd picked up trouble. Sheriff Cole mentioned a horse, said folks were sniffing around again." His gaze shifted past Henry to the paddock where Ash grazed, ribs still faint beneath his coat. "That him?" Henry nodded. "That's him?" Mark studied the horse a long while before his eyes cut back. "Looks like Willow." The words landed sharp. Henry stiffened, but before he could reply, Eli rose from the steps. "She was his mama," the boy blurted, holding up the faded photograph. Mark blinked, caught off guard, and for the first time noticed the boy's presence fully. "And you are?" Mark asked, his tone more accusation than question. "Eli," Henry answered for him. "He's staying here for now." Mark frowned, but didn't press. Instead, he walked toward the fence, boots crunching gravel, his eyes fixed on Ash. The horse lifted his head, ears twitching, and for a heartbeat the valley fell silent. Father, son, horse, all of them bound by ghosts that refused to loosen their grip. "You never told me," Mark said finally, voice tight. "Didn't seem worth telling," Henry muttered. Mark turned, anger flashing. "Not worth telling? You kept a bloodline like that a secret? You let her disappear, let everything fall apart, and now you think it wasn't worth telling?" His voice cracked on the last word, the pain in it raw, unguarded. Eli shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between them. Henry's chest ached, but he kept his own voice steady. "We lost enough back then. I didn't see the point in digging up more." Mark shook his head, the distance in his eyes wider than the years between them. "You always did that. Shut down. Lock it away. Pretend silence is strength. But it's not." The words cut because they were true. Henry looked away, toward the cottonwood where a swing had once hung, swaying under Daniel's laughter. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Eli stepped closer, his voice small but firm. Ash isn't just a horse. He's proof we can start over. Both men turned to him, surprised by the conviction in the boy's tone. He trusts us now, and maybe we're supposed to trust each other too. The silence that followed was thick, but different than before. Not empty, charged, waiting. Mark's eyes softened a fraction, though his jaw still held tight. Henry exhaled, slow, letting the words settle. That evening, the three of them sat at the table. Supper passed in halting conversation, the scrape of forks louder than the talk. Yet when Eli leaned against Ash in the paddock afterward, brushing him under the fading light, both men stood side by side on the porch. Neither spoke, but neither turned away. For the first time in years, father and son stood close enough to share the same silence. And in that silence, broken though it was, a thread of something fragile and unfinished began to weave itself through the ruins they had carried too long. The days that followed Mark's return stretched long, each one threaded with unease. The valley seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the next strike. Henry rose early, more restless than before, pacing the yard with his rifle slung across his shoulder. Eli stuck close to Ash, brushing him until the horse's coat shone faintly despite the scars. Mark, though quieter than his father, carried his tension in the way he walked, scanning the horizon with eyes that had learned to expect trouble. Three souls lived under one roof again, bound not by peace, but by vigilance. Late one evening, the air turned heavy. The clouds bled across the sky in a bruised purple. Tauntaun. Wind carried the metallic smell of rain not yet fallen. Ash grew restless, circling the paddock, ears pinned back toward the distant tree line. Henry noticed it first, the prickle in the air, the way the cottonwoods went still as if even the birds had gone silent. He set his coffee down and stepped into the yard, calling over his shoulder, "Something's wrong." Mark followed without hesitation, his jaw set. Eli scrambled behind them, clutching the brush he had carried out from the barn, his thin frame taut with unease. Then came the sound, a splintering crack, loud and deliberate. The back fence had given way. Shadows moved against the dark grass, figures sliding low and quick across the meadow. Henry's grip tightened around his rifle. "They're here." Two men stepped into view, their faces half covered by bandanas, their hands carrying rope and steel. One pointed toward Ash, who snorted and wheeled in panic, hooves striking the ground. The boy darted forward, shouting, "Leave him alone!" His voice wavered, but carried into the night. Henry's heart jolted. "Eli, stay back!" But the boy didn't. He ran straight into the paddock, planting himself near Ash's side. The horse, though agitated, shifted closer to him, as if drawing strength from the boy's presence. The intruders advanced. Mark lunged forward, tackling one to the ground just as the man swung a length of chain. They hit the dirt hard, fists flying, the sound of impact sharp in the night air. Henry leveled the rifle at the second figure, who had a rope coiled, ready to throw. "You take one more step. You don't walk back out," Henry growled, his voice cutting like the wind itself. But before the rope could fly, Ash charged. The horse's hooves thundered against the earth, body surging with a strength born from years of survival. He slammed into the man, sending him sprawling into the mud. The rope scattered, Useless. Eli flung his arms around Ash's neck, whispering frantically, "It's okay. It's okay." His words barely audible over the chaos. Mark wrestled his opponent into the dirt, pinning him with a strength Henry hadn't seen in years. The man cursed, thrashing, but Mark's grip was iron, his rage sharpened by something more than anger, by years of disappointment and silence now set ablaze. Henry fired a warning shot into the air, the echo rolling across the valley like thunder. The sound broke whatever courage the intruders had left. One scrambled free, dragging the other with him, both limping toward the tree line until the darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment, all that remained was the heavy breathing of man and beast, the smell of sweat and soil, the sound of Ash's heart hammering through the quiet. Eli clung tighter to the horse, tears streaking his cheeks. Mark stood, chest heaving, mud smeared across his shirt. Henry lowered his rifle, his hands trembling from more than age. The three of them stood together in the paddock, the cottonwood swaying above them, the sky clearing just enough to reveal a scatter of stars. Ash shifted, pressing his scarred shoulder into Eli's chest, then flicked an ear toward Henry and Mark. In that stillness, Henry felt something deep move through him. A reminder that family wasn't always chosen, but it could still be fought for. The meadow smelled of rain and earth, but beneath it lay something else, the raw truth that shadows were not done with them yet. Trouble had come once more, and it would come again. But now, Henry knew they would meet it together. Man, boy, and horse bound by scars, standing their ground against the darkness that sought to claim them. The following morning carried a silence that was not peace, but exhaustion. The air over the valley hung heavy with the scent of trampled grass and gunpowder, remnants of the night before. Henry sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee gone cold. Across from him, Mark leaned back in his chair, bruises blooming along his jawline, shirt torn at the sleeve. Between them, Eli ate quietly, his eyes flicking from one man to the other, as if gauging whether the fragile ground they stood on would hold. Sheriff Cole arrived just after sunrise, his truck pulling into the yard with the deliberate slowness of a man who had seen too much trouble to rush into it. He stepped out, boots crunching gravel, hat pulled low against the glare. He studied the broken fence and the churned earth of the paddock, then the rifle leaning against the porch rail. His sigh was deep, drawn from somewhere older than the day. "They're not random thieves," Cole said as he joined Henry by the porch steps. "Those men are tied to a ring I've been tracking for years. Illegal stud operations, stolen mares, foals passed off under false papers. Your horse, Ash, he's not just a survivor. He's a piece of evidence someone doesn't want found." Henry's jaw tightened, his eyes on the paddock where Ash stood, his coat gleaming faintly in the morning light. "He's more than evidence," Henry said quietly. Cole nodded, his gaze softening. "I know. But understand, if he's Willow's blood, like I suspect, he's the proof we need to bring that whole operation down. And that means they won't stop coming until we make this public." Inside the house, Eli clutched the faded photograph tighter, listening from the doorway. His voice broke the silence, small but clear. "Then tell the world. Let them see what they did to him. Let them pay for it." His eyes flashed with something stronger than fear, something close to fury. Mark looked at his father, then at the boy. "He's right. We've hidden long enough. You always thought silence protected us, Dad, but it only kept the wounds open. Maybe it's time we did something different." The words struck Henry like hammer blows. He remembered the years after Daniel's death, how he had folded inward, convinced that locking grief away was the only way to survive. He had shut out his wife, his son, his own voice. And now here stood Mark, carrying the weight of that silence, demanding something more. That afternoon, Cole gathered statements, photographed the scars on Ash's hide, recorded Henry's account of the auction. Eli watched every moment, his hand resting on Ash's neck, grounding the horse through the attention of strangers. The boy's face was pale but steady, his thin shoulders squared as if he had grown years older overnight. When Cole left, he promised reinforcements, promised that the ring would not escape justice this time. But his words could not erase the unease that lingered. Shadows still stretched long across the meadow, and every creak of the cottonwood felt like a warning. That evening, Henry found Mark outside by the paddock. His son leaned against the fence, arms crossed, eyes on Ash, as the horse grazed in the fading light. For a long time, they stood in silence, the distance between them filled with years of unspoken grief. Then Henry spoke, his voice rough but steady. "I should have told you. About Willow. About everything. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was drive you away." Mark's shoulders sagged, his face shadowed with hurt. "You didn't just drive me away, Dad. You made me believe I wasn't enough to stand beside you. I thought maybe you blamed me for what happened to Daniel. Maybe you couldn't stand to look at me because I was still here when he wasn't." Henry's chest tightened, shame burning like fire. "I never blamed you," he whispered. "I blamed myself, and when I couldn't carry it, I carried silence instead." Mark turned then, his eyes wet, his jaw trembling as he tried to hold it back. "It took Eli to say what neither of us could. That horse isn't just surviving for himself. He's forcing us to face what we buried." The truth hung heavy in the cooling air. For the first time, Henry reached out, laying a hand on his son's shoulder. The contact was awkward, stiff, but it was a beginning. Mark didn't pull away. In the paddock, Ash lifted his head, ears flicking toward them, as though he, too, understood the shift in the air. Eli stepped up beside the horse, brushing a hand down his scarred neck. "He belongs here," the boy said softly, almost to himself. "So do we." Under the fading Montana sky, with the scars of past and present laid bare, the three of them stood together at last. Man, son, and boy, bound not just by pain, but by the fragile, unyielding truth that silence could no longer hold. And in that truth, for the first time, Henry felt the faint stirrings of something he had thought lost forever. The chance to be whole again. The storm that had lingered over the valley for weeks finally broke, leaving the air washed clean, the sky a hard blue, stretching endlessly above. The cottonwood swayed gently, its scar-etched trunk catching the sunlight in the paddock. Ash stood tall, his coat no longer dulled to the color of despair, but catching glints of silver where the light touched. The scars were still there, pale against his skin, yet they looked less like wounds now, and more like stories he carried openly, unashamed. Henry leaned on the porch rail with a mug of coffee in hand, the steam curling upward. Mark sat on the steps below, elbows on his knees, silent, but no longer distant. Their silence was different now, not heavy with regret, but calm, a quiet that could hold both men without breaking. Inside, Eli came running with the faded photograph, clutching it like treasure. He crossed the yard barefoot, dust rising around his steps, and pressed the picture into Henry's hands. She was his mama, Eli said with conviction, though no test would ever prove it. And he's here now. That's what matters. Henry studied the photo one last time, Willow's bright form frozen in summer sunlight, then lifted his eyes to Ash, grazing just beyond the fence. The horse lifted his head at that exact moment, as if answering a call from years ago. Henry's throat tightened. Yeah, he murmured. That's what matters. Cole's truck rolled into the drive a little later, bringing news that the ring had been broken open. Arrests made, records seized, and Ash's scars photographed as part of the case. He's not just a survivor, the sheriff said, standing by the paddock. He's the witness that brought them down. He tipped his hat, his voice softer, as he added, You did good, Callahan. Henry didn't answer. He only nodded, his eyes on the boy and the horse. Eli climbed through the fence, carrying an old halter Mark had found in the attic, cracked leather with a brass plate still etched with Willow's name. The boy slipped it over Ash's head, his hands trembling, but Ash didn't flinch. He lowered his muzzle instead, leaning into the boy's chest with a trust that had been carved out of pain and patience. Tears stung Eli's eyes, but his smile was wide and sure. Can I ride him someday? He asked, his voice full of something fragile but unbroken. Henry looked at Mark, who met his gaze without bitterness this time. Mark gave a slow nod. Henry turned back to Eli. When he's ready, Henry said gently. And when you are too. The boy's face lit up, hope shining brighter than the morning sun. He pressed his forehead to Ash's, whispering something only the horse could hear. Ash snorted softly, a sound that carried across the yard like a benediction. That evening, the three of them gathered by the paddock as the sun slid low, painting the fields in gold. Ash trotted in a loose circle, tail streaming, hooves light against the earth. Eli laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, and for the first time Henry didn't flinch at the memory it stirred. He let it wash over him, a reminder that laughter could return, even after years of silence. Henry sat back on the porch, Mark beside him, both men watching the boy and the horse against the horizon. The years of grief and distance didn't vanish, but they loosened their grip, making space for something else. Something new. Henry's chest ached, but not with sorrow. It was the ache of life returning, of walls breaking open. Ash slowed, coming to a halt near Eli, his head high, his body outlined in the amber light. For a moment, the meadow seemed to hold still, as if the world itself were paying attention. Henry's voice came low, more to himself than anyone else. Saving this horse was saving ourselves. Mark glanced at him, eyes softer than Henry remembered, and said nothing. He didn't have to. They both understood. The cottonwood creaked gently in the wind, the scars in its bark glowing faint with sunlight, echoing the scars on Ash, echoing the scars in the men who stood beneath it. But scars were no longer only marks of pain. They were proof of survival, proof of stories carried forward. As night approached, stars pricked the sky one by one. Eli stayed out in the paddock, lying in the grass near Ash, sketchbook open on his knees. The boy's pencil moved fast, tracing the outline of horse and horizon together. His lips curved in a smile that seemed older than his years and brighter than the night about to fall. Henry looked out over the land, the fences repaired, the house no longer hollow, the meadow alive again with the sound of trust reborn. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel haunted. He felt whole. And that was how a forgotten horse, bought for just $100, brought back hope, healed old scars, and rebuilt a broken family. If this story touched you, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Let me know you're here. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next stories will take you even deeper into the bond between people and the animals that change their lives forever.